Yes, thank you very much, Dennis, for this very nice invitation, for being here at this seminar, and for giving me the opportunity to present my ideas to the audience. So, as you've already told, yes, the title of my presentation is "I Can't Live With or Without You." And it's about the challenges of an ecological transformation on natural resource dependent societies in the global south. And the starting point, of course, is COVID-19. And I think it's talking to you from home office in Bogota, it's kind of impossible not to start with this pandemic in these days, in these months. So I think we are on a turning point, and we do not know where we will go in the future, but there might be, and I think there is still a kind of a historical opportunity for a very much needed ecological transformation. So that we cannot go back to normal seems to be mainstream. Of course, not everybody does agree. There are people or like important politicians like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro who might not agree. But if we look here, we can see on the left, there is a colleague from Argentina, Maristela Swampa, who is, of course, more from the left, and that's not so surprising. We have the Pope, who also talks about the need to change, perhaps also not that surprising in having in mind some of his positions. But we have also the Secretary General of the United Nations talking on this topic, and very on the left from Friday for Future. All that are persons who talk for and who rally for the need for an ecological transformation. However, and my point is a different one. My point is that's very much in the mainstream. As you see in the center, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who already before COVID-19 in her inaugural speech talked about the European Green Deal. And in April, I think it was, she talked in a video message. She said the following: by using the European Green Deal as our compass, we can turn the crisis of this pandemic into an opportunity to rebuild our economies differently and make them more resilient, so that we also leave a better place for our children. So here is the idea in a, well, we can arguably say very mainstream organization like the European Union, to change the economy and to have a more green economy as a compass of the European Union. Secondly, and that's a policy paper from the OECD, Building Back Better, there's also these ideas that the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis to be durable and resilient, we cannot go back to business as usual, and we need to change this environmentally destructive investment patterns, activities. So basically, it's about the topic as long-term emission reduction goals, so resilience to climate impacts, slowing biodiversity loss, and increasing circularity of supply chains. So of course, we should not make the mistake to take these words as things that will really happen. But I think we can see that here is a kind of a change in the discourse and in the way of, or what we now can see is that, for example, Germany thinks that at least in 2020 they will reach the climate goals just because of the economic downturn of COVID-19. So that we can perhaps call with Peter Richter that we are facing something we can say degrowth by disaster. However, what is my argument? Well, my argument is that, of course, we need this kind of ecological transformation if we want to have future for our planet. However, there is a kind of a barely addressed dilemma. So it is, of course, necessary change the economy and reducing, for example, fossil fuel use, but there is also a risk of causing severe economic and social crisis as well as political turmoils in resource-dependent countries. And that's what I want to discuss with you in this talk, in this discussion. So first of all, if we look at this map from UNCTAD last year published on natural resource dependency around the world, you can see, and that's of course not surprising, that arguably all the global south, with very, very few exceptions, are resource dependent. Resource dependency for UNCTAD would be 60% of export is natural resource based. And if you look at this lighter blue, it's 60 to 80, the darker blue is 80 to 100%. So basically we can see that it's Sub-Saharan Africa, it's Middle East, North Africa, it's also Central Asia, and it's especially Latin America, and here especially South America are resource dependent. How do we address these kind of resource dependency in research, in theory? Well, there is first of all a kind of this resource curse argument. So basically that natural resources lead to bad development outcomes. Generally, not all, but generally these resource curse arguments are based on neoclassical foundations, focus mostly on large N comparisons and quantitative data, and focus on, let's say, like indicators like economic growth, institutions. They talk about bad or good institutions, and there is this rent-seeking argument. We have also another approach which comes more from a new institutional foundation developed basically in the Middle East, or talking about Middle East and Iran and well, the Gulf states, focusing on state, region type, and especially authoritarianism in this rentier state framework. Also on, it's more like a qualitative data approach, and there are also small n comparisons. But basically, and that's really an innovation from Latin America. I'm not sure those of you joining us at working on other regions, if it's known, this approach of the neo-extractivism. I think in the last years, some colleagues from Sub-Saharan Africa also took on this approach. Basically, we have different ideas, and it's a well, 10 years or 11 years ago, it was introduced into the academic debate. There is this, let's say, this strain who work from the international political economy, and there is others sometimes linked who work more on political ecology, looking at socio-environmental conflicts. However, I think, and that's really an innovation, we shouldn't only think about the economy. So if we talk about neo-extractivism, of course it's important for the economy. Of course it's important also for the way how politics work. But I think it's all-encompassing social model. And I think that's an important way. So we have to look at the economy, and we have to look what happens with natural resource dependency. What are the impacts on the economy, not only on growth, also on the production matrix, on productivity, and so on. But we also have to look at what happens in the society. So that is, of course, the basic indicators of social development, like poverty, like basic needs, but also inequalities, but perhaps also the way how society works, how society and politics works, what kind of power relations are built around this extractive model. We also have to look at society-nature relations. So that's really something, if we look, for example, at Bolivia or Ecuador, where we have seen some important changes with this buen vivir or good living approach. But however, how society and nature interacts, that's a third point of this idea of new extractivism. And from my point of view, we also have to look at the kind of cultural patterns and identities that are constructed around this extractive model. So, however, I would like to not to talk too much about theory. Of course, it would be great to discuss about these issues later. I would like to look at empirical cases. So, what really happens now in this kind of pandemic? What are the consequences for natural resource dependent societies? And of course, we could look at the usual suspects. So we could look at Venezuela with this very fierce crisis, which has even, of course, started before. And the same would be true if we look at Ecuador, another Latin American country. But however, it's not only Latin America. We could look at Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Angola. We could also look at Nigeria or the Gulf Cooperation Council and so on. So all these, and you can already see that I will focus on oil-dependent countries especially, because the downturn of the pandemic does not impact on all kind of natural resources in the same way. We can actually see that gold is really booming in this moment, whereas we can see that oil has really there's really been a very important downturn on oil prices. However, I would like to look more on the local level, so not looking at whole societies, at whole countries, but basically what happens on the ground empirically in the oil cities, and then also thereby taking a kind of a local turn in the debates on natural resource and development. Looking at Latin America, which is my field of research, we could look, for example, at some countries which, oil is important, but perhaps they are not the classical oil countries. That is perhaps not the case for Mexico, although Mexico is a more diversified economy with a lot of the so-called maquiladoras. And we could look at the state of Campeche in the south of Mexico, which is clearly oil dependent. In Colombia, where I'm now based, we could look at cities like Barranca Bermeja, which is like the cradle of oil in the country, but also on other parts in Meta, in the southeast of the country. We could look at Peru. We could look, and that's what actually I would like to do, at the city of Comodoro Rivadavia, which perhaps you might not know. It's not so famous, but it's really a textbook case of an oil city. And if you do not know so much about Comodoro, that's not no problem. So here you can see Comodoro Rivadavia is located at the south of Argentina, at the province of Chubut in Patagonia. The province of Chubut, we can see at the south is Comodoro Rivadavia. Also Sarmiento would be like the oil region of this province. In the north, we have, for example, Trelew and Rawson, the capital of the province, which is like the administrative center of the province. In the west, there is Esquel, which would be a different story, a very interesting story, where we talk about where it has been possible from the local social movement to stop a mining project. However, I will focus on Comodoro Rivadavia, and as you can see here from data of the energy Ministry of Argentina, we can see that Chubut is today the most important Argentine province when it comes to oil extraction. So just give me or let me talk a little bit on the importance of oil for the province of Chubut. So we can, of course, that's changing a lot, but we can say that 40% of Chubut's GDP is based on oil. 40 to 60% of the exports of the province are based on oil. The public revenue of Chubut is like 20 to 30% is oil, but if it comes to Comodoro Rivadavia, it's 90%. And in Comodoro Rivadavia, a city which, according to official data, has like more or less, a little bit less actually than 200,000 inhabitants, there are 25 to 30,000 jobs which depend directly on oil extraction. I said officially there are like 200,000 because people from Comodoro, my colleagues from Comodoro, they stayed, and even from the minister or from, let's say, the city officials, they think that there might be 300,000 persons living in Comodoro. And the importance of oil, that was an interview I conducted in 2016, so some years ago, with the very important, very mighty president of the Oil Workers Union, Jorge Avila, who I think that he brings it, or he sums it very, very, very good up, talking about that in Comodoro and in Chubut, everyone lives on oil. The whole province, the police, the hospitals, everything you see in this city lives on oil. So, however, there was a debate about, is oil really something positive for Comodoro, or is it something negative? So basically, based on these discussion about oil, if it's a curse or a blessing. And these are discussions that were, that we saw during the last oil boom until more or less 2014. So when oil prices peaked at more than $100 per barrel. So first of all, and that's basically the position from people from Comodoro Rivadavia, not only, but especially from Comodoro and Chubut, they say, well, it's really a good thing. Or so there is 20%, the GDP is 20% above natural average, and we have very positive development results. So at least the official position in Argentina and in Chubut and Comodoro Rivadavia would be a positive one. So low poverty, lower unemployment, relatively low social inequalities. However, even in the boom, Maristela Swampa and Enrique Viale, in a book which is called Mal Desarrollo, so bad development, perhaps you can translate it, they talk in a small chapter, they talk about Comodoro Rivadavia, and they say, well, that's really an emblematic case for bad development. So first of all, that seems to be contradictory. However, this kind of 20% above national average GDP, we can put it in question when we think about this approaches. For example, if you have in mind the book written by Morten Jerven on Sub-Saharan Africa, Poor Numbers, we know that per capita GDP is a kind of an indicator which might be problematic, and which is especially problematic if we do not know how much people live in a city or in a country. So as I already told, officially there are 200,000, but perhaps there are 300,000. So perhaps this per capita GDP is not such a good indicator. The same is true if it comes for social development results. Yes, the poverty data are relatively low, but they are based on a national, or there was a change in the accounting, on a provincial poverty line. And actually prices in Comodoro Rivadavia are well above the average. So we have also to put in perspective these kind of indicators. However, Swampa and Viale made in different points. They talk about, let's say, I'm not sure if it's a good expression, but about things we could talk about like social ills. So it might be, first of all, working conditions in the oil sector are really hard, and a lot of accidents and a lot of problems. Also, a lot of problems with drug abuse, illicit and illicit drug abuse, human trafficking, prostitution, and so on. Things we know from other cases of enclave economies, of extractive projects. And of course, and that's the main point, Swampa and Viala also point out the important social environmental damage which are linked to the oil extraction in Comodoro Rivadavia. So, and perhaps I should highlight that Comodoro Rivadavia started oil extraction more than 100 years ago, and the city was really based or built on oil. And if you go now to Comodoro Rivadavia, you will see oil wells very close to people living. And if you talk with local historians, they talk about that it's really normal, that it has been really normal some decades ago, that the children play really some 100 meters away from oil wells. So it's really, it's very, very close, and it's very, very present, this kind of oil extraction in the city. However, what has happened? The current oil price downturn, which did not start, of course, with the COVID-19 crisis. We can see in 2009, there was already a downturn in oil prices due to the global economic and financial crisis. But then oil prices recovered. But in 2013-14, oil prices again faced an important downturn and stayed relatively low. Well, that's also a discussion if it was a kind of back to normal or if it's a low oil price. However, in this COVID-19 crisis, we see that oil prices really turned down, and there were some in the media, you could see that oil prices got into minus. And so, however, perhaps not so much focusing on that. There is other comparisons where also in the media, some told that, well, a barrel of oil is cheaper than your subscription to Netflix. And basically, for me, we see also that now oil prices are recovering, but they still basically low. And that's basically the story behind of that is basically that due to COVID, to the lockdowns, there was less production, less activity, less demand for oil. And so what we could say perhaps that what happened here was like a laboratory for what might happen if European Commission, OECD countries, and perhaps others really put into practice what we can talk about an ecological transformation. So if they do not use anymore so much oil, then we could perhaps think about having too much oil. It's not yet the question of peak oil, so that there isn't any more oil for activities in the global north, but it would be a change, and that perhaps the global north does not need any more oil. And the question is, what are the consequences? So what I want to do now in the next, perhaps 10 minutes, which I will talk, is to look at Comodoro Rivadavia in order to analyze what happened here in this oil downturn, what happened really in this situation of the COVID-19, and what are the consequences for a very much oil-dependent city and province. So first of all, looking at the economy, of course, and that's, that's not a news, actually, severe economic and fiscal crisis. So the whole economy, the whole world is face an important economic crisis, and of course that's also true for Argentina, and it's especially true for the Chubut province, although data are not yet so we do not have so much data yet. But if you look at and talk to the colleagues and look at the local media, you can see that there was really an important crisis and a fiscal crisis from the province and from the city of Comodoro Rivadavia. That also is not something which started with the COVID-19. It has already been before, due to the oil price downturn from 2014 onwards, but it's now much more severe. If you look at social development, poverty rates are really increasing, are skyrocketing, like we can also see in other parts of the world, of course. Unemployment is increasing very much. We have decreasing real wages, and especially there are salary arrears for public officials. Once again, that all did start before the COVID-19, and actually there are salary arrears, for example, for hospital or for health workers, and that especially now in this situation, really a very dark scenario. We have salary arrears for teachers and for other public officials, and that's basically a consequence of the fiscal crisis of the Chubut province, but also of the municipality of Comodoro Rivadavia. And these salary arrears also had as a consequence a political crisis, of course. So you can imagine that public officials were rallying against, basically for getting their salaries, and there were especially teacher unions blocked some streets, some important streets, and of course in a city like or in a province like Chubut, in a city like Comodoro Rivadavia, the important streets they have blocked last year were the streets that lead towards the oil fields, and there what happened were violent clashes, where basically people from the oil workers union violently opened the streets, and there was really important demonstrations, both from the teacher unions, but also from, and here especially from persons from the oil worker union, against these kind of demonstrations. So we see that there is also a potential for important political crisis. So these are issues we could say, well, yes, we could imagine that that will happen. Perhaps there is this kind that there is less demand for oil. Perhaps that might be good news for the environment. However, actually, that's not really the case. First of all, the answer from the local politics is basically thinking about expand extraction. So basically the idea is, well, oil prices are low, so we need to extract more in order to get our revenues to a more or less normal level. The other part of the story is what do the extractive industries, the companies, do? Well, they ask for easing environmental standards. They say, well, environmental standards are really putting cost high, and so we need to ease them. And also, it's not only about environmental standards; it's also about labor standards. So reducing, for example, protection, and that might give more or give way for much more accidents. However, there's also another discussion in the province of Chubut. So in Chubut, there is a ban on the mega mineria, which might be large-scale mining. However, now this is put in question in the political debate. This is put in question because political debate, the argument is, we have to diversify the economy. That's of course true. However, diversification is seen in Chubut, and I think that's the case for also some other natural resource dependent societies all around the world, is seen as a diversification within the extractive pattern. And so the idea here on mega mineria is basically on a kind of extraction of uran, which is also, well, there's also a potential in the province, and the idea would be to start this kind of extraction. And of course, there's also the debate on the case of Esquel, which I already mentioned before. So basically, we can see, yes, there are problems with oil extraction, but without oil extraction, problems continue. So if we put it into a more general perspective, we can see, yes, there are kind of perhaps contradictions within the sustainable development framework, well, this 2030 agenda from the United States. First of all, we have to, and I think that's important to stress this point. Without an ecological transformation, there are really important risks for all of the world, but we know that ecological crises are not socially neutral. The same is true for smog. So there are some which are more affected, and actually much of the natural and oil-dependent societies are pretty much affected by the consequences of climate change. For example, if we look at the Gulf region, at the countries from the Gulf Cooperation Council, the climate change, global warming, is really putting at risk human life in the Gulf countries. So it's a contradictory situation for them. Not the same, but similar is the situation for Comodoro Rivadavia, especially when it comes to questions of rain and changing of the climate there, that they are really vulnerable to that. However, on the other hand, we have other kind of goals. So just to let me to close this idea. So basically, much of these oil-dependent countries really need a change of the consumption patterns, of the extraction patterns, in order to make possible to continue to live there. However, on the other hand, there are also negative aspects if we cannot have a transformation of the productive patterns in these societies. And actually, if we look at diversification initiatives, that's nothing new. So the idea to sow the oil is was, for example, introduced in Venezuela in 1936, and there were so much political activities to reduce dependency of oil in Latin America, in the Gulf states, in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the result basically was always the same, and it did not work out. So, and if that's the case, then we can see what I have introduced very briefly on the case of Comodoro Rivadavia, that there are really problems when it comes to other kind of sustainable development goals, like the goal of decent work and economic growth. So that's really put into question if there isn't anymore the demand for oil, especially in these at the local level. Social development, if it comes to, for example, poverty rates, if it comes to education, health, that all depends on oil in these societies. And we could even talk about peace, justice, and strong institutions, so the SDG 16, when it comes to these clashes. And of course, perhaps it's not so probable that that's good news, that it comes to kind of a civil war in Comodoro, in Argentina, Comodoro Rivadavia. But actually, what we can see is that there are more political and social turmoil, which we also saw in other parts of Latin America last year. Which, of course, we cannot say that the only cause for that is the reduction of natural resource prices and the revenue crisis of the states, but that was clearly one of the factors. And let me just close this talk with some ideas about what we should perhaps look more on in research. So first of all, I think if you look at the SDG agenda, and there is work, and actually at Gießen with other universities in Latin America and Central Asia, we are researching on possible contradictions in the SDG agenda, the SDG nexus approach. There's also my colleague Carlos Larrea from Universidad Andina, Simon Bolivar from Ecuador here in this discussion. So that's something I think we should increase to work on these kind of well, contradictions between different sustainable development goals. However, I think we should also look more on Latin America, but perhaps you could also say the Global South and international politics. So what are the consequences on changes in the international politics on the Global South? And also, once again, talking about changes also in integration into the global economy, of course, thinking about alternatives, which might be old-fashioned debates on a new economic world order, but perhaps we should and we have to talk about that once again. And perhaps another issue which might be of interest, looking not so much on natural resources as a curse or a blessing, but also trying to research much more on internal dynamics of what I call rentier societies, so these natural resource dependent countries. And well, thank you very much. It's still in German, but I think, yeah, okay, so here I stop, and really looking forward for discussion, for critiques, for comments.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. This has been really enlightening. I really enjoy, I think you put on the table again these dilemmas that we are facing as humanity, and particularly, of course, these natural resource dependent societies that on one hand need to continue living and having an economic activity, and on the other hand, they urgently need to change their patterns of extraction, for sure, no? So I would give now I think it's time to give the chance to our listeners and viewers to raise comments or questions. Please, if you can, go to participants and raise your blue hand. Otherwise, you can also directly turn on your cameras, or you can also write a question or a comment in the chat area, no? So I see that Carlos, yeah, turned on his camera. Carlos, do you want to make a question or a comment?
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was a very insightful case study about local or regional or provincial, in that case, effects of the COVID crisis and the collapse of oil prices. And you were talking about alternative paths to recovery. And essentially, you presented two options. One that probably from the political perspective might be feasible is to deepen extractivist activities, expanding oil production and turning on to mega scale mining. I think in the case of Ecuador, for example, also it seems to be a kind of option facing the current crisis. And the second is trying a diversification of the economy based on expanding green activities. I think in the case of Comodoro Rivadavia, Chubut, and the Patagonia, more generally, the possibilities of electricity generation based on wind and solar energy are very high. So I don't know if they have been trying to expand the capacity of that is substituting oil. Instead of getting more oil, they can provide to the country green energy. It can be analyze it as a possibility. I think Chile is doing so in the Atacama Desert with great success. So that can be first an option. I have a second question linked with oil costs and prices, because one of the effects of the decline of oil prices and probably the lasting effect of the recession is that future oil prices are turning more unpredictable and lower than expected before the COVID crisis, because of the expansion of green recovery, for example, in the case of Europe or so. So the oil peak demand might be an important factor. So many reserves are turning unprofitable, given that in the case of oil, you need a continuous process of investment to keep wells working. So I don't know about the extraction costs in the case of Chubut, but it can be an interesting variable to see whether or not oil expansion in the future might be feasible.
I contest directly. Okay.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Carlos. Yes, actually, these are two of the debates which are very, very important in the case of Chubut. So first of all, the idea of wind energy is, it's one of within, or people discuss it on the political level, and they have discussed it some decades ago. And it's a little bit the same what happens in much parts of the world. So during the oil boom, people debated about it, but they didn't do so much. So it was oil, and they lived very well on oil, with all the problems that also brings the oil extraction on the social, environmental level. And now it seems that there are not so much resources, because they would need some kind of support from the province or the nation. And as you know, and the Argentinian nation is also in a fierce crisis now. So it's once again the same problem, that when in times when resources are, or when the state does have the resources, it seems that there does not happen so much. Perhaps Ecuador was a different case. They did a lot of investment in changes of the productive matrix, but it didn't work out. So that's perhaps the second problem here. But yes, that's an option. And but if we look now in these days, in these months, and into the political debates in Chubut, it's really about more extraction. And of course, there's also the debate in if kind of wind energy would be a kind of a part of extractivism. And these are, for example, debates in, I think, in Mexico, in South Mexico, and so. The second issue on oil prices, yes. The collapse, and if there, what are the possibilities for Chubut to continue this oil extractive model? That's actually, it was quite interesting when I did my field work in 2016, 2017, did interviews with local politicians. So the official, or well, the idea of the oil reserves, officially the data are like, I think it's 20 years more of oil. So it's really, they are running out of oil. However, at the ministries, people told me, yes, that's true, but actually with new technologies and of course more investment and still thinking about a scenario of higher prices, we can live for more than 100 years more on oil. So this is basically the debate on what are really the oil reserves. But now in this scenario, yes, I would truly agree, that would be unprofitable. It is still to be seen if, for example, companies will continue to invest, and all these issues. That's, I think that we will see it in the future. But yes, that's really that's really a scenario which we see in Comodoro, and I think in Ecuador as well. And but perhaps there is one point more I would like to stress, because what we do not see in Comodoro, and I think that's the same, for example, in Venezuela, that's the same, well, in a very different context in the Gulf countries. We talked in Latin America last years really a lot, and totally, well, there was really a lot of mobilization against extractive activities. That does not happen in Comodoro Rivadavia. In Comodoro Rivadavia, there is, or actually I'm in contact with those who are against oil, but they, in the interviews, they say, well, we are like 10, 15 or a little bit more people in a city, in a province where everybody agrees on oil. So there is really a large consensus on oil extraction, and they are seen as the crazy ones. How is it possible that you talk in a city like Comodoro Rivadavia that you would like to change and stop oil extraction? So that's, I think, also something. There is really a cultural pattern on oil. So it goes even, if you look at the local beauty contest is the queen of oil. If you look at all the city museums, is the Museum of Oil. The local airport is named after the father of oil. All the neighborhoods are linked. The names of the neighborhoods are linked to oil. So it's really something which is permeating the whole society, and which also is a question for all workers, which are, well, really an important part of the population there. And it's like this pride of working in oil, and also family traditions of working in oil. And that's also the question, well, perhaps we could change towards green energy, but what do these people do then? Well, what will happen there? What does this do with this on the more cultural, identical level, which I think is also a question which has to be addressed, which has to be studied, which has to be discussed.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan, and also Carlos for the questions. I don't see any hand raised, so I will take the opportunity to ask a question, a more general question, because it called very much my attention that you showed us, or I perceived that like two faces of the same coin, no? Like this pandemic as an opportunity, and you yourself in one of your slides ask us if, or ask in general, if this oil price downturn would be a herald of an ecological transformation. And I see a kind of hope at global level that this pandemic would really bring some kind of change of paradigm in development, no? On one hand. On the other hand, of course, there is this reality that this pandemic is showing us very much many axes of inequalities, I don't know, between North and South, or this technological gap, or gender issues. So there are all many inequalities that are shown through this pandemic. And as you yourself mentioned, the idea is for many people to rely on more extraction. We know, for example, also that more plastic is being used. Fires didn't stop in the Amazon region. So we have these two different visions. Maybe one wants to believe, no? So what I miss, and I would like to ask you, is what do you think that we as researchers could do really to support this new world economic order, if you want, or to make it this more fair, so to say? And also because I know you work with communities, no, and you're very much related with communities in Colombia. What are they doing, and what is the position of these communities in front of these dilemmas, the hope and the sad reality somehow that we are seeing?
Yeah, well, yes, I think there are these two paradigms, and I think it's still open, the decision. What will happen in the next, so in the next years? So I think perhaps the most I hope that that will not happen, but perhaps we have to think about that. These are nice words from the European Commission, and hopefully, or if COVID stops in some moment, everything will really go back to this bad normal. However, I think that there is still this possibility to change, and I think there is also, when I look at what happens in Europe, I think that there is a possibility with state money to perhaps to modernize, and this modernization might also go towards a more green way of production, a greener economy. But well, that was something we will see in the future. Of course, in the global south, and well, I will talk about Latin America and on South America and the cases I know, more or less. I think what we can see in this pandemic, and totally agree with you, that the world hasn't been a good place before, and now we can see that these contradictions, these negative consequences, much more, or it's like really we can see them daily in the streets. So when you talk about inequalities, when you talk about social problems, when you talk about this the gender inequality, so basically we can see that COVID, yes, it's not socially neutral. It has a class, it has a race, it has a gender, and I think that's important to see. And I think what can we do as academics? Well, I think what we need as an academic is basically go out of our comfort zone of seminars and so on, which of course we also have to do research, publication in peer-reviewed journals. That's important to do so, but I think that's not all we have to do. We have to bring these discussions, we have to involve, and I think that's actually something which happens in Latin America quite a lot. Perhaps in Europe or in Germany we have to do much more on this. To bring our ideas into the public debate, into the political debate, and also to work together with communities and trying to really put our messages into the social debates. And basically, when we look at Latin America communities, of course, it's always a little bit difficult to talk about what do communities think, what do communities do. But actually, especially here in Colombia, yes, here are a lot of communities at the local level rallying against extraction. And basically there are a lot of so-called consultations, so previous consultations, which is really an issue in Colombia because from the national level they try or they banned these kind of consultations, but we can see that at the local level here is a lot of resistance, not in all places, but in a lot of places, a lot of resistance against new extractive projects, especially in mining. And of course, that's something we can see that, for example, in Comodoro, when I talked about this consensus on oil, that's a different issue. But we also have to see these kind of communities who are at the local level the most affected of the negative consequences, both socially, but also and especially environmentally. And I think that's also something we, and here I talk on a we from academics, but also in Europe academics, we should also bring these voices into the debates in Europe. So thinking about, for example, what happens in Colombia with coal extraction in the north, which is pretty much linked to Europe, to Germany, bring these issues, these negative consequences into the debates. Yes, I think there is something where academics and communities should work much more hand in hand, and especially I think it's the task of the academics to do research and to bring these results into debates.
Okay, Great, great. I think that's what your work is doing. We are also trying. And yeah, it's very clear that the issues are urgent, no? So thank you very much for your insights, for your presentation. And there are no questions or comments. I thank everybody here for participating, but Diana, would you like to make a question? Maybe the last one, given that we have very little time left, but please go ahead.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say that it's a pleasure to have Dr. Peters here also in this academic context. And just briefly, during your presentation, you were talking about dependency or natural resources dependent countries or societies, but it is in terms of imports. I think that it could be also important to say the dependency in terms of exports, no? Perhaps a map, as you shown during your presentation, which reflects the dependency from North countries. It could be also interesting in this context. This in one hand, and on the other hand, so very briefly, I want to ask you what is the analysis that you can make about the fracking in Colombia. So the government are arguing that the fracking, the oil fracking, is like an opportunity to reactivate the economy after this COVID crisis. So how we can analyze in this context of crisis or low prices, an strategy or a political strategy like the fracking in Colombia. I know that could be very large and we don't have enough time, but it is all. Thank you very much, Dr. Peters.
Yes, thank you for these two points. And first of all, this import dependency of in the global north. Yes, it's an issue, but actually, for example, OPEC, this was a little bit like the idea of having in mind that the global north is dependent on oil imports. Well, that might give power to the oil exporting countries if they make an alliance. However, today I think OPEC, and that's what often happened in the past, OPEC, sometimes they really have a lot of power. If we look at the 70s, when for those of you in Germany, if you can imagine that it was prohibited to drive on the highway in Germany on Sundays, and that's for Germans, that's really hard not to use their cars on the highway. So, and we could see that it was really a moment when there was power at the exporting countries. But today, I think OPEC is quite in a crisis. So if we look at this struggle between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is another part of the story of the oil price collapse. If we look at United States as a new, or not so new, once again, important country with important oil extraction, and that's pretty much linked also to fracking, of course. So yes, it is a topic, but perhaps today the oil exporting countries are not in such a good position. And when it comes to fracking, well, yes, it's true. In Colombia, people say, well, we need now fracking because we need more money. And that's basically the same argument, which we can see in Comodoro. Well, prices are low, so we need more extraction. Our salvation, what also Carlos told about Ecuador, the salvation is more extraction. However, in fracking, so what we know, at least until now, fracking is, there is a technology which is quite expensive. So fracking is feasible if prices are high. Actually, the collapse of the oil price is a problem for fracking. Perhaps that's good news for us as a humanity and for people in the communities. Surely it might be good news. And so actually it's a quite interesting, so in Colombia, and I suppose that's the same is true in other countries, if politicians say, well, we need fracking, their idea is that everything will turn back to normal. and prices will recover, and that will be so that will make it possible that these activities will grow, will continue. However, if it's true that the recovery of oil prices will be slow and it will remain very, very, very low, it might be that in 10 years, if there's really this kind of an ecological transformation in the global north, it might be, and that of course it's looking a little bit in the crystal ball, but it might be that in 20 years nobody will talk about fracking because it's just too expensive and prices are too low, and there is still cheap oil in other parts of the world. So of course it's not totally fracking or not, but new projects of fracking, we will see if there is really the capital, the risk capital, if they are really willing to invest, to continue to invest in fracking.
Okay, thank you, Diana, for your question. Thank you once again, Stefan. Very happy, very, very honored to have you here. And to all the rest, let's see each other again in a new colloquium, and we will continue working together, hopefully, Stefan, in the future. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Have a nice day, have a nice afternoon there.
Okay.